A verse-by-verse study in the book of Genesis, ESV, with Irv Risch, chapter 24. What does Genesis chapter 24 mean? Genesis 24 describes in great detail how Rebekah came to be the wife of Abraham's son Isaac. The story begins with what sounds like a deathbed scene, though Abraham will apparently live another 35 years. Abraham summons his oldest and most trusted servant and commissions the man with a specific mission. He must find for Isaac a wife from among Abraham's people back in Mesopotamia. Abraham is so urgent that he requires the servant to swear an oath binding himself to completing this task. More specifically, the servant must not allow Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman, but Isaac must not leave Canaan in order to marry a Mesopotamian woman. Genesis 24 verses 1-4. The servant receives a caveat: if he cannot find a woman willing to return to Canaan to marry Isaac, the servant will be released from his oath. Abraham, though, is confident God will make this happen, even sending an angel to guarantee success. Genesis 24 verses 5-9. The servant arrives in Mesopotamia at the town of Nahor, which shares the name of Abraham's own brother. Eager not to fail in his mission, the servant prays to Abraham's God and asks that if any of the young women coming to draw water at the town well offer to water his 10 camels, she will be the one God has appointed for Isaac. Genesis 24 verses 10-14. Before the servant has finished his prayer, Rebekah enters the scene and does exactly as the servant has asked. He immediately gives expensive jewelry to Rebekah. He asks if her family has room to accommodate a visit from himself and his company, including their camels. He also asks who her father is. Genesis 24 verses 15-23. When Rebekah names her father, the servant knows exactly who she is. She is the granddaughter of Abraham's own brother Nahor. This is better even than the servant had hoped. He knows now that the Lord has led him to the exact young lady intended for Isaac. As Abraham has requested, he has found Abraham's kinsman and identified a bride for Isaac. He immediately worships the Lord right in front of Rebekah. Genesis 24 verses 24-27. Rebekah hurries home and soon her brother rushes to the well to welcome this servant of their family member Abraham. Invited into the home of Rebekah's father Bethuel, the servant presents his mission, telling in great detail how the Lord led him to Rebekah. Finally, he asks if they will give Rebekah in marriage to his master Abraham's son Isaac. They agree, stating that they could do nothing else given what the servant has told them. Genesis 24 verses 28-51. After a brief negotiation the next morning, Rebekah agrees to leave that very day to travel with the servant to the land of Canaan. At the end of the journey, she meets Isaac, now 40, for the first time. Genesis 25 verse 20. He allows her to live in the tent of his late mother Sarah, and soon they are happily wed. Genesis 24 verses 52-67. Chapter context: Genesis 24 takes place a few years after Sarah has died. Abraham becomes urgent to find Isaac a wife, not among the women of Canaan, but from his own people back in Mesopotamia. His trusted servant, sent to accomplish this mission with the help of the Lord, eventually returns with Rebekah, the granddaughter of Abraham's own brother. Isaac is married to her at the age of 40. Abraham's death is recorded in the following chapter. Verse by verse. Verse 1. Now Abraham was old, well advanced in years. And the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. Abraham was old and full of years. Scripture often uses this language at the end of a person's life to set up their final actions. Abraham, however, will apparently not die for another 35 years or so. Genesis 25 verses 1-11. In fact, he will marry another wife and have several more children. Still, Abraham's conversation as reported in this chapter contains his final recorded words in Genesis. Many times in Genesis, God promised to bless Abraham. This is one of the few verses which indicate that God had, indeed, blessed him in all things. In addition to the birth of Isaac, God had blessed Abraham with great wealth and status in the land. He had not yet received the promised possession of the land of Canaan promised to his offspring, but Abraham was known as a man blessed by God in all things. Context summary: Genesis 24 verses 1 to 9 describes an urgent conversation between Abraham and his most trusted servant. Abraham is asking the servant to swear an oath to find a wife for Isaac from among his own people in Mesopotamia. The servant must not allow Isaac either to marry into a Canaanite family or to leave the promised land of Canaan. With the understanding that he will be released from the oath if no young woman will agree to return with him, the servant swears to find Isaac a wife. Verse 2. And Abraham said to his servant, the oldest of his household, who had charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh. As a wealthy man blessed greatly by God in all things, Abraham would have had many servants. Here he selects his most trusted servant, and the oldest of all his servants, for a crucial assignment. This servant is never named, but we are told that he was in charge of everything Abraham owned. He was Abraham's right-hand man. Earlier in the book of Genesis, Abraham named a man, Eliezer, as his prospective heir, since at that time he had no sons, Genesis 15 verse 2. At that point in time, Eliezer would probably have been considered Abraham's most trusted servant. The man Abraham speaks to here, decades later, might be the same person, and many interpreters assume this is the case. However, chapter 24 never specifically names him, so this might well be a different person. Abraham begins by asking the servant to swear a sacred oath to complete the assignment he's about to give him. That request is concluded in the following verse. Verse 3. That I may make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and God of the earth, that you will not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, among whom I dwell. Abraham is asking his most trusted servant to take a sacred oath to complete a crucial assignment, finding a wife for his son Isaac. Many interpreters assume this servant is Eliezer, the servant mentioned decades earlier as the possible heir of Abraham's estate, Genesis 15 verse 2. However, this particular passage never specifies exactly who this man is. Abraham begins by asking the man to place his hand under Abraham's thigh. This would have involved the ancient Middle Eastern custom of swearing an oath to a man while touching his genitals as a sign of the importance of the commitment. Strange as that may sound to modern culture, this was a gesture of profound symbolism. It implied that the one swearing the oath would answer to the other man's seed, his offspring, if the oath was not kept. Abraham, however, also insists that his servant also swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, binding him to answer to God if he failed to do as promised. Abraham, apparently concerned that he might die before Isaac could be married, asks his servant to swear not to let Isaac marry a local, Canaanite woman. In the following verse, he will add that Isaac must marry a woman from Abraham's former homeland and extended family. Further, though, Abraham will insist that Isaac not be allowed to leave Canaan to search for this bride, Genesis 24 verses 5 to 8. Verse 4. But will go to my country and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. In the previous verse, Abraham asked his most trusted servant to swear an oath. This promise was to not allow his son Isaac to take a wife from among the local, Canaanite women. Apparently afraid that he might die before Isaac could be married, Abraham further asks his servant to swear to find a wife for Isaac among the women of Abraham's old homeland and extended family. Why is Abraham so urgent about this request? He is aware of God's promise to make from him a great people who will belong to the Lord. This promise from God was also to give Abraham's offspring the land of Canaan, as their own possession. He apparently does not want Isaac to marry a Canaanite woman and to begin to assimilate into the Canaanite people as one of them. He is concerned, even in this first generation, that God's people maintain a separate and distinct identity from the people of the land of Canaan. Later, the Israelites will be officially commanded by God not to intermarry with the people of the land of Canaan, Deuteronomy 7 verses 1 to 4. Then, as now, the issue has nothing to do with race. Rather, the concern is over faith, avoiding the particularly wicked practices of the Canaanite people. Verse 5. The servant said to him, "Perhaps the woman may not be willing to follow me to this land. Must I then take your son back to the land from which you came?" Abraham has asked his most trusted servant to swear to find a wife for his son Isaac. This man is explicitly charged with finding a woman of Abraham's extended family, in his old homeland outside of Canaan. Before swearing to do so, however, the servant responds with a reasonable objection. What if I find a girl, but she doesn't want to travel away from her family to a strange land to marry a man she's never seen? Should I then take Isaac back to your people to live among them? The servant's question is very reasonable. He needs to know if marrying a girl from Abraham's people is so critical that Isaac should be taken to live in Abraham's former old homeland, if no woman will agree to come to Canaan. Abraham's response will fully resolve that question. His absolutely forbids the servant to allow Isaac to return to Mesopotamia. Abraham does not want to jeopardize, in any way, his descendants' possession of the promised land. Verse 6. Abraham said to him, "See to it that you do not take my son back there." Abraham has asked his servant to swear to find a wife for his son Isaac among his extended family back in his old homeland. The servant has asked what to do if a woman cannot be found who is willing to live in Canaan. Should Isaac move to Abraham's old homeland to live in order to be married to one of the women of his extended family? That's a reasonable question, since Abraham is so absolutely set on Isaac marrying a woman from that region. Here Abraham makes his position clear. In no uncertain terms, Isaac cannot be allowed to go to Mesopotamia. In fact, Abraham instructs the servant not to take Isaac back to that land. Isaac's place is in the promised land of Canaan. This is the home of Abraham's future offspring, period. Isaac must not be allowed to leave and, by implication, risk settling outside of Canaan among Abraham's extended family. Abraham has established why this mission is so critical. Isaac must not marry into a Canaanite family and thus be assimilated into the Canaanite people. This is a spiritual issue, not a racial one. Abraham does not want to risk the identity of Abraham's descendants as God's chosen ones. But Isaac also must not return to Abraham's people and settle outside of the land of promise, which would also risk the family's loss of identity as those who belong to God. Only one path would work. Isaac must marry a woman from Abraham's people and also live in the land of promise as a people living among, but separate from, the Canaanites. Verse 7. The Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, "To your offspring I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, and you shall take a wife for my son from there." Abraham is answering his servant's very valid question, what to do if he could not find a woman willing to move away from her family and live in the land of Canaan as Isaac's wife. Abraham insists that God will make it happen. More specifically, he is sure an angel of the Lord will intervene in such a way as to bring it to pass. Where did Abraham's confidence that God would work in this way come from? He remembered that the Lord did the exact same thing in his own life. He came to Abraham in the land of his own people and took him from his father's house and promised to give the land of Canaan to his offspring, Genesis 12 verses 1-7. If God did that in Abraham's life, the Lord would also do that in the life of this woman Isaac was meant to marry. Abraham's confidence in God's ability to move people where he wanted them was based on the experience of God acting in his own life. We, too, can have confidence in God's ability to work in the circumstances of others as he has worked in ours. Verse 8. But if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you will be free from this oath of mine, only you must not take my son back there. In the previous verse, Abraham expressed confidence that God would make a crucial mission successful. The servant Abraham is sending is meant to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, among Abraham's people in Mesopotamia. An angel of the Lord would go before his servant to ensure that a suitable wife would be found for Isaac among Abraham's people, a woman willing to move from her family and live in the land of Canaan. Now, though, Abraham assures his servant that if he's wrong, if the woman is not willing to return to Canaan, then the servant will be released from the oath. The most important thing is that his servant not take Isaac out of Canaan under any circumstances. Did Abraham make this concession because he suddenly doubted God would provide? Probably not. More likely is that Abraham wanted to reassure his servant. This would make it easier for the man to swear to take on this mission without himself having to be confident that God would supernaturally intervene. Verse 9. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of Abraham his master and swore to him concerning this matter. Abraham has ordered his servant to find a wife for Isaac, among Abraham's kinsmen back in Mesopotamia. However, Isaac is not to leave Canaan, the woman must be brought here. The servant is concerned he might not be able to find a suitable woman and convince her to travel so far to marry Isaac. So, Abraham made it clear to his servant that this oath would not be binding if circumstances were beyond his control. With that reassurance, as Abraham had requested, the servant would swear not to allow Isaac to marry any local Canaanite woman and would, instead, travel himself to the land of Abraham's people to attempt to find a wife for Isaac who would agree to marry him and live in Canaan. The servant put his hand under Abraham's thigh, as was the custom, and took the oath. This symbolic gesture implied that the oath-taker would be at the mercy of Abraham's descendants if he did not fulfill his end of the bargain. The whole conversation raises an obvious question: where was Isaac? As a man around the age of 40, Genesis 25 verse 20, why did he not participate in this conversation? Why was Abraham's servant given so much authority over Isaac's decisions instead of Isaac himself being included? We're never told. Perhaps custom demanded that finding a wife was absolutely a father's duty and one Abraham could not fulfill without the help of his servant. Perhaps Isaac was a particularly passive person. In any case, Abraham saw it as his responsibility to find his son a wife without, apparently, Isaac's input. Verse 10. Then the servant took 10 of his master's camels and departed, taking all sorts of choice gifts from his master, and he arose and went to Mesopotamia to the city of Nahor. Abraham's servant has accepted his mission and sworn his oath. He will do all he can to find a wife for Isaac among Abraham's people in northwest Mesopotamia, also known as Aram Naharaim. To that end, he takes with him a demonstration of Abraham's great wealth, beginning with 10 camels. In that era of the Middle East, apparently, camels were not yet common. To bring 10 of these rare, useful animals would communicate great riches to the family of any prospective wives. In addition, the servant packed a variety of expensive gifts to present to a potential bride and her family. Custom demanded that a suitor give gifts to the bride's family. Abraham's servant would make sure not to fail in his quest due to a lack of generosity. Sufficiently equipped, the servant soon arrived at his destination in the city of Nahor. Nahor was the name of Abraham's brother, Genesis 11 verse 27, making this a good place to start looking for a bride among Abraham's kinsmen. Context summary: Genesis 24 verses 10 to 27 follows Abraham's servant from Canaan to Mesopotamia on his mission to find a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's people. Arriving at the town of Nahor, the servant prays that God will reveal the right woman by allowing her to be the one to offer to water his 10 camels without being asked. A young woman named Rebekah immediate does exactly that. When the servant learns this young woman is also the granddaughter of Abraham's brother Nahor, he quickly worships God for bringing him to the right woman in so little time. Verse 11. And he made the camels kneel down outside the city by the well of water at the time of evening, the time when women go out to draw water. Abraham's servant is on a mission to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac. He has been sent to find the family which Abraham left behind in Mesopotamia. The servant is not named, though some believe this is Eliezer, mentioned earlier as Abraham's prospective heir, Genesis 15 verse 2. Having arrived at his destination in the evening, Abraham's servant needed to water the camels. He makes them kneel down by the town well outside the city. It was the time women would typically come to the well to draw water for their families. Abraham's servant is likely tired from his journey, but he has a specific plan in mind to find the right woman for his master's son, Genesis 24 verse 12. Verse 12. And he said, O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham. Abraham's servant has arrived at his destination. His mission is to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, from among Abraham's extended family back in Mesopotamia, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. The city of Nahor, named after one of these relatives, is a likely spot to begin searching. The servant has made his 10 camels kneel down by the well outside the city. These animals, themselves, would have been a sign of great wealth and power. At this time in the Middle East, it seems, camels were not yet commonly used. This servant has also brought lavish gifts to give to a prospective bride. Those material goods are not his only plan, however. Now, he prays to God. More specifically, the servant prays to Abraham's God for Abraham's sake. He asks Abraham's God to give him success in this mission of Abraham's. And he asks that God would, in doing so, show his steadfast love to Abraham. Has there ever been a more servant-minded servant? Not only is he doing what his master has asked, he is doing it with the prayer that his master's God would show love to his master. This prayer of faith still stands a model of selflessness and servanthood 4,000 years later. This is especially poignant, if this servant is, in fact, the man Abraham named as his potential heir many decades ago, Genesis 15 verse 2. In this particular passage, the servant is not named, but it's possible that this is the very same man. Verse 13. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water, and the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. Abraham's servant continues to pray to the God of my master Abraham, asking for success in his mission to find his master's son a wife. Abraham has sent him to find a wife for Isaac, specifically from Abraham's extended family back in Mesopotamia, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Now the servant becomes very specific in this request. He describes where he is sitting by the spring, the well, outside the city of Nahor. This was named for one of Abraham's relatives, making it a good place to start the search, Genesis 11 verse 27. The servant describes to God how the daughters of the men of the city are coming out to draw water. In the following verse, he will ask God to give him a specific sign about which of these young women will be Isaac's wife. Verse 14. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, Please let down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, Drink, and I will water your camels, let her be the one whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master. Abraham's servant continues to pray to the God of my master Abraham, asking for success in his mission to find his master's son a wife. He has been sent to find a woman from Abraham's extended family in Mesopotamia, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. The city of Nahor, named after one of Abraham's relatives, is a good place to start, Genesis 11 verse 27. His prayer reflects a desire to see Abraham's wish fulfilled. Now, the servant becomes specific in this request. He wants God, in essence, to allow one of these young women to be the one God has chosen for Isaac. He also wants a sign from God about which one it is. The servant's plan is this: he will ask the young women to draw some water for him to drink. The one God has chosen will be the one who says, Drink, and I will water your camels also. What this young woman would be offering in watering the camels would not be a small task. Abraham's servant had 10 thirsty camels with him. That will require drawing a lot of heavy water. In addition to seeking a divine confirmation from God about which girl is the right one, it's likely the servant also intends this as a test of the girl's generosity and servanthood. Anyone willing to serve in this way without being asked would be demonstrating good and generous character. The servant is not merely looking for the prettiest or the most eager young woman, he is sincerely seeking a woman of depth and virtue. The servant concludes his prayer by saying that when the Lord does this for him, he will know that God has shown steadfast love to his master. God's answer to the prayer will be a sign of God's love. Verse 15. Before he had finished speaking, behold, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel the son of Milcah, the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder. Abraham's unnamed servant is on a mission to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac. He has been sent specifically to Abraham's extended family in Mesopotamia. His first stop is at a town named for one of Abraham's relatives. There, he prays for God to give him a sign about which woman he should bring home for Isaac. Specifically, he is seeking a woman with a generous spirit. His prayer involves asking for water, and seeing if a woman volunteers to also bring water for his camels, not a small task. Even before Abraham's servant has concluded the prayer described in the previous verses, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 14, Rebekah walks into view carrying a water jar on her shoulder. God immediately responded to the servant's sincere prayer to show love to Abraham by showing the servant the appointed girl. Rebekah is the granddaughter of Nahor, Abraham's brother, Genesis 11 verse 27. Her father Bethuel was born to Nahor's wife Milcah, Genesis 22 verses 20 to 23. The servant did not yet know all of that, but this means that not only will Isaac's wife be from among Abraham's clan, she will be of his more immediate family. Verse 16. The young woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Abraham's servant has been praying that God will give him a sign. This sign is meant to confirm that he has found the right woman to marry Isaac, Abraham's son. The servant has asked God to show him the woman he should approach, based on her generosity and kindness, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 14. The previous verses revealed that Rebekah walked into view even before Abraham's servant finished asking God to give success to his mission. The servant does not yet know that this girl is the granddaughter of Abraham's own brother, Genesis 22 verses 20 to 23, but he does see that she is very attractive. While this is a wonderful thing, it's important to note that the servant's prayer made no mention of appearances. He is seeking a woman of character, first and foremost, and her beauty will turn out to be an additional blessing. He watches as she goes down to the spring, meaning the well, fills her water jar, and starts to head back into the town. He decides he must talk to her. Verse 17. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water to drink from your jar." Abraham's servant, resting by the well outside the city of Nahor, watches Rebekah fill her water jar and begin to return to the city. He has been sent to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, and recently began praying for God to send the right woman to the well, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4, 12 to 14. Before he has even finished this prayer, asking God to show him a woman who is kind and generous, Rebekah appears. Now he approaches her, seeking to put into effect his plan to find the girl God has appointed for Isaac. In the previous verses, the servant's prayer was that the appointed woman would respond to his request for water by offering to water his 10 camels, as well. So the servant asks for a drink, and Rebekah's response is found in the following verses. As it turns out, this woman is not only beautiful, Genesis 24 verse 16, she is also hospitable, Genesis 24 verse 18. This is the very one God has intended for Isaac. Verse 18. She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. In the previous verse, Abraham's servant approached Rebekah, asking for a drink of water. His plan, according to his prayer to God, is that one of the women at this well will respond to this request by offering to also bring water for the servant's 10 camels, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 14. This is no small task, so such a favor would suggest a woman of high character. The servant intends to pursue the woman this test signifies. She is, presumably, the one God intends to be bring back as a wife for Isaac, son Abraham. Before the servant had even completed his prayer, an attractive woman appears, and he decides to put into effect his plan to find the girl God has appointed for Isaac. So the servant asked her for some water to drink. Here, she responds by quickly giving him a drink from her jar. The emphasis on her immediate reaction is meant to show Rebekah's generosity. Verse 19. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking." This is the moment Abraham's servant has been waiting for. Though, to be honest, he hasn't been waiting long. He had asked God that the girl destined to marry his master's son, Isaac, would respond to his request for water by offering to water his 10 camels, as well, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 14. Before he has even finished this prayer, an attractive young woman appeared at the well, Rebekah. So, the servant decides to begin immediately and ask the woman for water. She quickly complies, while Abraham's servant waits to see if she offers to water the camels. Now Rebekah does exactly that. Without being asked, she offers to draw water for his camels until they have finished drinking. With 1 water jar and 10 thirsty camels, that is no small task. It could take a while. By God's grace, the servant has found God's bride for his master's son almost immediately after arriving at his destination. Rebekah doesn't know that, yet, of course. And the mission is not yet complete. The servant still has work to do, convincing Rebekah and her family to accept a marriage proposal and a long journey. Verse 20. So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough and ran again to the well to draw water, and she drew for all his camels. Abraham's servant had asked God that the girl meant to marry Isaac would offer to water his camels without being prompted, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 14. In the previous verse, Rebekah did exactly that. Now she follows through on her offer to keep bringing water to the trough for the camels until they are finished drinking. She acts quickly and thoroughly. This is likely well beyond what Abraham's servant would have hoped for. Not only has God given the sign that the right girl has been found, she is demonstrating a generous spirit, a sense of hospitality, and a genuine work ethic. The emphasis on Rebekah acting quickly seems to confirm that this is unprompted behavior. She's sincerely acting out of goodwill, not being coerced or manipulated with guilt. This is a key feature in how Abraham's servant has approached his task to find a wife for Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. His prayer specifically asked God to send a woman of character. Rebekah's beauty, Genesis 24 verse 16, is certainly a good thing, but it's not the primary trait this man is looking for. Verse 21. The man gazed at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. Abraham's servant has come to a city in Mesopotamia named after one of Abraham's relatives, Genesis 22 verses 20 to 23. His quest is to find a suitable wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. To fulfill this request, the servant prayed that God would send a woman with a generous spirit. This would be shown if the servant asked for water, and a woman responded by offering to also bring water for his 10 camels, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 14. As shown in this verse, God has answered the servant's request so quickly that he is left speechless. Or perhaps he is resisting the urge to decide too hastily that a wife has been found for his master's son. The fact that Rebekah arrived before he has even finished his prayer, Genesis 24 verse 15, seems too good to be true. The servant is clearly loyal to Abraham, and he wants to be sure this is actually the right woman for his master's son. Had the Lord truly granted success in this quest so quickly? Is this really the girl God means for Isaac to marry? Abraham's servant ponders this while Rebekah completes the lengthy process of carrying water, 1 jar at a time, to a trough until 10 thirsty camels have had their fill. Verse 22. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took a gold ring weighing a half shekel, and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels. Abraham's servant prayed for a sign from God to help him complete his mission to find Abraham's son, Isaac, a wife, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Before that prayer had even been completed, Rebekah appeared and fulfilled the exact request made by the servant, Genesis 24 verses 12-19. Apparently convinced that God has led him to Rebekah as a potential bride for Isaac, Abraham's servant takes the next steps in making the proposal, to secure her as a wife for his master's son. He starts by giving her very generous gifts of a gold ring and 2 bracelets. The weight of these items communicates their value. A half shekel, also referred to as a beka, was about 1/5 ounces. These gifts, weighing more than 4 ounces, would have been worth thousands of dollars, in their modern equivalent. Rebekah may have assumed that the servant was repaying her act of generosity in watering his camels. She doesn't know that he is beginning negotiations for her hand in marriage by the giving of gifts and demonstrating just how wealthy his master is. Verse 23. And said, "Please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" Abraham's servant has prayed that God would send a sign regarding the right woman to marry his master's son, Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 12-14. The young woman who appeared before he had even finished this prayer, Genesis 24 verse 15, immediately fulfilled this sign, Genesis 24 verse 19. Abraham's servant then begins the marriage proposal process, by giving Rebekah very generous gifts of a gold ring and bracelets. These would have been worth thousands of dollars in modern times, so his gift is not only lavish, it would certainly have gotten Rebekah's attention. The servant now asks if there might be room for him and his company to stay in her father's house for the night. After she has received his gifts, perhaps he hopes she will be more willing to extend further hospitality. The servant also asks who her father is. Her answer in the following verse will further confirm for him that the Lord has indeed arranged this encounter with Rebekah. His mission from Abraham was to find a wife from among Abraham's extended family in Mesopotamia, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Her answer confirms that God has, indeed, sent the right bride for Isaac. Verse 24. She said to him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel the son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor." A servant sent by Abraham has spoken with Rebekah at a well in Mesopotamia. This encounter came after the servant was commanded by Abraham to find a wife suitable for Isaac, his son, among Abraham's extended family. The servant's prayer for a sign, Genesis 24 verses 12-14, was answered immediately, Genesis 24 verses 15-19. And so, he offered lavish gifts to Rebekah in order to begin the process of convincing her to come back to Canaan, in order to marry Isaac. First, though, the servant wants to be sure that this woman is actually part of the family Abraham has asked him to contact. As we will see in the following verses, Rebekah's answer to the question about who her father is provides a great surprise and delight for Abraham's servant. More, it is even further confirmation that God has arranged the whole encounter. The Lord has led the servant directly to the girl he intends for Isaac to marry. Rebekah replies that her father is Bethuel, the son of Nahor and Milcah. The servant apparently knew his master's history well since he recognized these names. Nahor was Abraham's brother. Milcah was the daughter of another brother. Abraham had received word of the birth of Bethuel and Nahor's other children, as recorded in Genesis 22 verses 20-24. Verse 25. She added, "We have plenty of both straw and fodder, and room to spend the night." Abraham's servant has already seen a sign from God, in response to his prayer. After being sent to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, among Abraham's family in Mesopotamia, the servant prays. In response to this prayer, Rebekah appears and fulfills the sign, Genesis 24 verses 12-19. The servant then gives her lavish gifts, and asks about her family and possibly staying overnight with her father, Genesis 24 verses 22-24. Her answer delights the servant. She is, indeed, part of the family Abraham wanted this man to contact. In addition to her unknowing revelation that she is the granddaughter of Abraham's own brother, generous Rebekah adds that her family does indeed have room for this traveling stranger to spend the night. She even thinks of the camels, mentioning they have both straw and fodder enough to accommodate the beasts. Given the room for both men and animals, Rebekah's family apparently has some amount of wealth. She stops short of offering to allow the company to stay with them. As a young woman in her father's household, that would not be her role. Rather, Rebekah's answer indicates that her family can accommodate the servant and his entourage, not that they necessarily will. Verse 26. The man bowed his head and worshipped the Lord. Abraham's unnamed servant demonstrates more faith and faithfulness to the Lord than many other men and women in Scripture who had direct contact with God. Not only does the servant pray for God to give success to his mission, he recognizes that God has done exactly as he asked. Before moving on, he stops right in the middle of this conversation with Rebekah and worships the Lord. Most of us realize how uncharacteristic this is even among the people of God. We may be humble enough to ask for help, for success in our efforts, to overcome an obstacle. We are much less likely to be quick to give God credit when He grants our request and to stop long enough to worship Him in response to His kindness to us. Verse 27. And said, Blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness toward my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to the house of my master's kinsman. When Rebekah reveals that her grandfather is Abraham's brother Nahor, the servant recognizes that God has indeed answered his prayers and brought him right to the doorstep of Isaac's future wife. He stops in the middle of his conversation with Rebekah and worships the Lord. His prayer reveals his heart. First, the servant blesses the Lord, addressing him once more as the God of his master. Next, he expresses his gratitude and relief that God still has steadfast love and faithfulness for his master. The servant was clearly concerned that if this mission failed, it would suggest that God was no longer concerned with Abraham. Finally, the servant includes himself in the prayer, giving God the credit for leading him not only to some distant relation of Abraham's, but to Abraham's own immediate family relations. One note: it was apparently common in this era and in Abraham's family for close relatives to marry each other. This early in human history, there was apparently little risk of genetic issues resulting from the offspring of family members, and God had not yet forbid Israel from marriages between close relatives. In fact, it will become clear that God very much intended for Isaac to marry his cousin Rebekah for the purpose of creating a people that were uniquely his own. Verse 28. Then the young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. This is turning out to be a momentous day for Rebekah. A servant sent by Abraham from the land of Canaan has arrived at a well in her home city, Genesis 24 verses 10 to 11. Unknown to Rebekah, this man is looking for a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. He was praying that God would send the right woman, just as Rebekah came into view, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 15. Seeing that she fulfilled a specific sign the man had asked for, Genesis 24 verses 18 to 19, he approached her with gifts and asked if her family could take his traveling group in for the night, Genesis 24 verses 22 to 25. After telling this traveling stranger that her household was large enough to accommodate both him and his animals, and then learning from his prayer of gratitude that his master was closely related to her family, she ran home to tell her mother's household all of this news. The next question for Abraham's servant will be how Rebekah's family will react to a proposal of marriage to his master's son in faraway Canaan. Context summary: Genesis 24 verses 28 to 59 describes how Abraham's servant, confident he has found God's intended woman for Abraham's son, approaches Rebekah's family to ask for her hand in marriage to Isaac. After being welcomed into their household, the servant tells, in great detail, the story of how God has led him to Rebekah and their home. Rebekah's father and brother quickly agree that they must allow this marriage to happen. After a bit of negotiation the next morning about when Rebekah will travel to Canaan, Rebekah agrees to leave that very day. Verse 29. Rebekah had a brother whose name was Laban. Laban ran out toward the man, to the spring. Rebekah has been speaking with a traveler from the land of Canaan. This man is a servant of Abraham, on a mission to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Rebekah arrived as the man was praying for God to send him a sign, Genesis 24 verses 12-14, and she unknowingly fulfilled that very request, Genesis 24 verses 18-19. The man gave her expensive gifts, and asked if her family was able to accommodate the traveling group for the night, Genesis 24 verses 22-25. Suddenly a new character, and a complication, bursts onto the scene of this unfolding drama. Rebekah had run home to tell the news about this stranger, his wealth, his connection to the family, and his interest in staying with them, Genesis 24 verse 28. Now her brother Laban runs back to the spring, the well, where Abraham's servant remains waiting. As Rebekah's brother, Laban will play a role in the decision of whether to accept the coming marriage proposal for Rebekah and to allow her to travel and settle away from the family. He will also play a role later in Genesis when Jacob, the son of Rebekah and Isaac, comes to him looking for a wife of his own, Genesis 29. The role of brothers, or fathers, in accepting marriage proposals, was common in that time. This was part of why Abraham had attempted to pretend that he was only Sarah's brother in years past, Genesis 12 verses 11-13, Genesis 20 verse 2. Verse 30. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arms, and heard the words of Rebekah his sister, thus the man spoke to me, he went to the man. And behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. Rebekah has come home to tell her family about some exciting news. A traveler gave her expensive gifts after she unknowingly served as the answer to his prayer, Genesis 24 verses 12-23. His quest is to find a wife for Isaac, the son of his master, Abraham, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. This news results in Rebekah's brother, Laban, coming to the well to meet the man in question. Although Laban will eagerly offer hospitality to Abraham's servant, much as Rebekah has done, this verse gives us reasons to be wary of Laban's motives. Is he simply wanting to welcome in the messenger of a distant relative, or is he most excited by the wealth suggested by the expensive gifts given to Rebekah and her story about the 10 camels? To this point, the only information Laban apparently knows is that a rich and generous man wants to stay at his home overnight. There has been no mention made, yet, that the man is seeking a bride for Isaac, back in the land of Canaan. In any case, Laban quickly finds Abraham's servant waiting by the spring. Verse 31. He said, "Come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house and a place for the camels." Rebekah's brother Laban, hearing her story of everything Abraham's servant had said to her and seeing the gifts that he gave to her, rushes out to the town well, or spring, and finds the servant waiting there. At this point, however, all Rebekah or Laban really know is that the man is wealthy and in search of Abraham's family. To this point, the servant has not revealed that his mission is to find a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Laban addresses the servant warmly, calling him the Lord's blessed one and inviting his company to come and stay at their house. Hospitality was a critical cultural value in this era, especially among reputable people. To leave anyone, especially a relative or potential guest, without accommodation would be seen as a grave unkindness. The quickness and eagerness of Rebekah and Laban in offering hospitality to Abraham's servant reminds us of Abraham's own eagerness to offer hospitality to the travelers who turned out to be the Lord and 2 angels in human form, Genesis 18 verses 1-15. It reminds us, as well, of Lot's urgent hospitality to the 2 strangers, also angels, on Sodom's final night, Genesis 19 verses 1-3. Verse 32. So the man came to the house and unharnessed the camels, and gave straw and fodder to the camels, and there was water to wash his feet and the feet of the men who were with him. Abraham's servant has recently discovered Rebekah, who seems to be the answer to his prayer, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 19. That request was for God to show him the exact woman he ought to bring home as a wife for Abraham's son, Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. After being warmly invited to stay at their household by Laban, Rebekah's brother, Abraham's servant arrives with his company of camels and servants. The passage provides some historical perspective on what that would look like. The camels would be unharnessed and provided food. All of the men are given the opportunity to wash their feet, which would have been quite filthy from a journey across the open country. Though mere servants of a wealthy master, all of the men and animals in the company are treated properly, with respect and hospitality. Verse 33. Then food was set before him to eat. But he said, I will not eat until I have said what I have to say. He said, Speak on. With the Lord's specific guidance and in answer to the prayers of Abraham's servant, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 19, his company has arrived at the household of Rebekah, God's appointed wife for Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. The servant and all with him, including the 10 camels, have been shown warm hospitality. The camels have been made comfortable and fed. The men have washed their feet. Now we see that an evening meal has been prepared and set before them. Abraham's servant, focused exclusively on fulfilling his master's mission, states that he will not eat until he presents what he has come to say. His host is perhaps surprised to learn the servant has an urgent message after what appeared to be a simple chance meeting with his daughter Rebekah at the well outside the city. Still, he urges the servant to speak. In the verses that follow, the servant will tell Rebekah, her father, and her brother the entire story of how and why he has come to them. Verse 34. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. Abraham's servant is convinced that God has chosen Rebekah to be Isaac's wife. Now sitting before her father and brother, the servant will tell the story of how he came to them and make his case for why they should accept this offer of marriage on her behalf. He begins by revealing who he and his master are. He doesn't name himself, despite assumptions that this man is Eliezer, Genesis 15 verse 2, he is never identified in this particular story. In fact, the servant never sees himself as central to the story, at all. This is not even about him. He represents Abraham. For the first time, he reveals to them that their relative Abraham, Nahor's own brother, is his master and the reason he is before them now. Verse 35. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great. He has given him flocks and herds, silver and gold, male servants and female servants, camels and donkeys. Abraham's servant begins to present his case for why Rebekah's father and brother should grant permission for her to travel back to Canaan and marry Abraham's son. He first brings news of how Nahor's brother Abraham is faring. In short, he's very, very wealthy. The servant gives the Lord credit for this. God has greatly blessed Abraham, and he is truly a great man. All of Abraham's great wealth has come from the Lord, including flocks, herds, silver, gold, servants, camels, and donkeys. The servant knew that the family had already seen 10 of the camels. That alone would have been a sign of Abraham's wealth. Part of the reason for emphasizing Abraham's wealth, of course, will be to assure the family that Rebekah would be richly provided for as a member of this family. For the servant, the point is also to assure them that this is a family blessed by the Lord, an even greater reason to trust that she will be secure. Verse 36. And Sarah my master's wife bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. Abraham's servant is describing the reason for his journey to Rebekah and her family. Though they don't realize it just yet, he is also making the case for the marriage proposal he is about to extend to Rebekah on behalf of Abraham's son Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. After establishing Abraham's great wealth and status, given by God, the servant now introduces Isaac. It matters that they know Isaac was born to Sarah when she was old, to establish that Isaac is not as much older than Rebekah as they might otherwise imagine. It also helps for them to understand that all of Abraham's great wealth and status and blessing will pass to Isaac alone. The servant is painting the picture of a supremely eligible bachelor, which indeed Isaac was. Verse 37. My master made me swear, saying, You shall not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites, in whose land I dwell. Abraham's servant has described the wealthy status of Abraham and his unmarried son Isaac, living in Canaan. Now he begins to describe the circumstances around his visit to Nahor, the town, and Nahor's extended family. He starts by answering the obvious question, why has Isaac not married a local girl? The servant's oath answers the question, Abraham forbids it. Isaac must not marry any of the women in Canaan. This was an issue of culture and spirituality for Abraham, not one of race. His concern was about mixing the godless approach of the Canaanites with that of his family. Later, this prohibition would become an official part of God's law for the people of Israel, Deuteronomy 7 verses 1-4. Rebekah's family will not likely understand Abraham's concern about Isaac marrying a Canaanite and losing his unique identity among the people there, but they will grasp the point that, for Isaac, the local women are not eligible. Verse 38. But you shall go to my father's house and to my clan and take a wife for my son. Abraham's servant is describing, in very precise detail, what has brought him to the household of Bethuel and his family. He is on a mission from Abraham to find a wife for Isaac. Isaac must not marry from among the women in Canaan, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Instead, Abraham sent the servant to the clan of Abraham's people, to his father's house, to find a worthy wife for his son. This is likely the first moment in which Rebekah and her family begin to understand that the servant is here to raise the issue of marriage. Verse 39. I said to my master, perhaps the woman will not follow me. Abraham's servant is telling Rebekah and her family the reason for his arrival at their doorstep. Abraham has sent the servant back to his people to find a wife for his son Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. The servant recalls challenging Abraham with the possibility that an eligible bride, once located, might not be willing to move away from her family to live in the land of Canaan with an unknown husband, Genesis 24 verses 5-8. He will share Abraham's response in the following verse. Verse 40. But he said to me, the Lord, before whom I have walked, will send his angel with you and prosper your way. You shall take a wife for my son from my clan and from my father's house. Abraham's servant is describing in great detail to Rebekah and her family the reason for his journey to their home. Abraham has sent the servant back to his people to find a wife for his son Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. The servant recalled, in the previous verse, challenging Abraham with the possibility that an eligible bride, once located, might not be willing to move away from her family to live in the land of Canaan with an unknown husband, Genesis 24 verses 5-8. Now he shares Abraham's response, the Lord will intervene. More specifically, the Lord will send an angel to give the mission success. Abraham knows this because he himself has walked with the Lord. Abraham insists that the servant will succeed, he will take a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's people. As the servant will explain, he has also seen evidence that God is working to bring Rebekah back to Canaan. Verse 41. Then you will be free from my oath, when you come to my clan. And if they will not give her to you, you will be free from my oath. Abraham's servant is describing to Rebekah and her family the reason for his journey to their home. Abraham has sent the servant back to his people to find a wife for his son Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Perhaps to make clear that he, the servant, realizes a woman may not want to travel back to Canaan to marry a stranger, he has told them that he raised this possibility with Abraham. Abraham told him that an angel would go with him to bring success to the quest, Genesis 24 verses 5-8. Now, though, the servant makes clear to Rebekah, her father, and her brother, that he has fully fulfilled his oath to Abraham simply by coming to Abraham's family and making the attempt to find a willing wife for Isaac. His oath does not require that a woman return with him to Canaan. The servant is bound only to seek out the right woman, not to come back with a marriageable woman at all costs. Verse 42. I came today to the spring and said, O Lord, the God of my master Abraham, if now you are prospering the way that I go. In the previous verses, the servant described to Rebekah and her family how Abraham had commissioned him to swear to travel to the land of Abraham's people and attempt to find a wife for Abraham's son Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. Now the servant moves on to the part of the story that happened earlier that day. He begins by describing his prayer to God upon arriving at the spring/well outside their city, Genesis 24 verses 12-14. He tells them of praying to the God of his master Abraham. This was the God he had already given credit for blessing Abraham with wealth and making him a great man. This verse begins the specific request the servant made of the Lord. It concludes in the following two verses. Verse 43. Behold, I am standing by the spring of water. Let the virgin who comes out to draw water, to whom I shall say, Please give me a little water from your jar to drink. Abraham's servant is describing to Rebekah and her family what he prayed to Abraham's God earlier that day when he arrived at the well outside of their town. He tells how he placed a kind of test on the Lord to find the right young woman. His choice of words here confirms that he is, as expected, seeking a virgin for Isaac. He will ask her to give him a little water to drink from her jar. If she responds in the way described in the following verse, the servant is asking the Lord to allow that young woman to be the one he has appointed for Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 12-14. As Rebekah listened to this story, the light must have begun to come on in her mind. She was the answer to the servant's prayer. Verse 44. And who will say to me, Drink, and I will draw for your camels also, let her be the woman whom the Lord has appointed for my master's son. Abraham's servant is in the middle of describing to Rebekah and her family what he prayed when he arrived at the spring outside their city earlier that day. He had asked his master's God to allow him to know the woman appointed to marry Abraham's son, Isaac, by her response to his request for a drink of water, Genesis 24 verses 12-14. Now he reveals what response he had asked God to use as a sign to him that he had found the woman. She would offer to draw water for his camels, as well, without being asked, Genesis 24 verses 15-19. Rebekah would now have understood clearly where the servant's story was headed. Her father and brother likely began to understand, as well. The servant is in the process of asking Rebekah to come back to Canaan with him, so that she can marry Abraham's son, Isaac. Verse 45. Before I had finished speaking in my heart, behold, Rebekah came out with her water jar on her shoulder, and she went down to the spring and drew water. I said to her, Please let me drink. Abraham's servant is describing the events around his meeting with Rebekah earlier that day by the spring outside the city. He had asked Abraham's God to allow the woman who offered to water his camels to be the one appointed to marry Abraham's son Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 12-14. Now he reveals that before he had even finished thinking his prayer, speaking in my heart, Rebekah walked into view with her water jar. After she filled it at the spring, the servant describes what he asked when he approached her, Please let me drink. The fact that Rebekah can verify that all happened exactly as the servant described from this moment in the story on will give credibility to the servant's account, Genesis 24 verses 15-19. Verse 46. She quickly let down her jar from her shoulder and said, Drink, and I will give your camels drink also. So I drank, and she gave the camels drink also. Abraham's servant now reveals the first pivotal moment in his interaction with Rebekah by the spring outside of town earlier that day. He had already set up the fact that he had prayed to Abraham's God, asking that the young woman who offered to water his camels without being asked would be the one appointed by God to be Isaac's wife, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 15. Then the servant tells Rebekah's father Bethuel and brother Laban what she already understood. She offered to do exactly as the servant had prayed. Her response lined up precisely with the servant's prayer, Genesis 24 verses 16 to 19. The servant will soon describe the second piece of information that convinced him Rebekah was truly God's woman for Isaac. Verse 47. Then I asked her, "Whose daughter are you?" She said, "The daughter of Bethuel, Nahor's son, whom Milcah bore to him." So I put the ring on her nose and the bracelets on her arms. Abraham's servant now describes the final bit of information he learned from Rebekah during their encounter at the spring earlier that day. This and the information that fully convinced him God had led him straight to Rebekah as the woman meant to marry Isaac. The servant had asked Rebekah who her father was. She answered with names the servant knew. Her father was Bethuel, the son of Nahor and Milcah. The servant could not have found any closer relatives to Abraham than these. Interestingly, the servant describes giving Rebekah the gift of the nose ring and bracelets after asking who her father was, Genesis 24 verses 22 to 24. Perhaps he simply mixed up the order, or perhaps he felt that Rebekah's father and brother would feel the gifts would have been more appropriately given after knowing what family Rebekah was from. As in other instances, Scripture faithfully records the truth of what certain people said or did, without necessarily claiming those words are accurate. Verse 48. Then I bowed my head and worshipped the Lord and blessed the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who had led me by the right way to take the daughter of my master's kinsman for his son. Abraham's servant describes his joy at discovering that the woman God led him to for Isaac was, in fact, the granddaughter of Abraham's own brother. His joy is expressed in his response. He immediately worshipped and blessed the Lord who led him on a straight path to Rebekah, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4, 12 to 19. The servant was not at all shy about worshipping the Lord in front of Rebekah or describing his worship of God to her family. In fact, the Lord was the central character in the servant's story, acting to bring about the best possible result, at least from the servant's perspective. It's unclear what Bethuel, Laban, and Rebekah thought about this God of Abraham. They lived in a part of the world known for its worship of the moon. The worship of various gods was built into the culture of the day. Did they know of Abraham's Lord specifically, or simply accept the idea of him as one of many possible unknown gods in the world? How much had Abraham told them about his visit from the Lord before he moved away? We just don't know. Verse 49. Now then, if you are going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master, tell me, and if not, tell me, that I may turn to the right hand or to the left. Abraham's servant finally reaches the end of his story. He has made his case for why they should agree to allow Rebekah to return with him to Canaan and marry Abraham's son Isaac. First, Abraham and, by extension, Isaac, are blessed by God and extremely wealthy. Second, the Lord had shown the servant that Rebekah was the girl appointed to marry Isaac by meeting the servant's test exactly. Finally, the Lord had guided the servant straight to Abraham's immediate family. Clearly, this is meant to be. So the servant asks the question, perhaps with a bit of manipulation, "Are you going to show steadfast love and faithfulness to my master?" He uses the same language he has used to describe how God has treated Abraham. Will Abraham's family members also treat him with kindness and good faith? If not, they should tell him so that he can take his search elsewhere. Their positive response in the next verse may have been hasty, as the following verses will show. It would have been difficult to say no to the servant's question after hearing his remarkable story, but perhaps Laban and his father were not yet fully ready to let her go. Verse 50. ESV Then Laban and Bethuel answered and said, "The thing has come from the Lord, we cannot speak to you bad or good." After hearing the full story from Abraham's servant and then hearing his forceful question, will you show loving kindness and faithfulness to Abraham? Rebekah's brother and father quickly respond that the decision is not theirs to make, after all. The implication of their words is that if this from the Lord, it doesn't even matter what they might think, bad or good. While this seems to be a positive response, in a way, it is not the end of the story. After the servant gives additional gifts and stays for the night, Genesis 24 verses 52 to 53, the family will realize how quickly Rebekah will be gone, and try to negotiate for her to stay a while longer. Genesis 24 verses 54 to 55. Verse 51. Behold, Rebekah is before you, take her and go, and let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. Laban and Bethuel, Rebekah's brother and father, have responded to the servant's urgent question about whether they would allow Rebekah to marry Isaac by saying, in essence, that it is not theirs to say. They have seen in the servant's story that this is the Lord's will. How could they disagree? And now they say the words the servant has been longing to hear, yes, take her and go. Let her be the wife of Abraham's son. The Lord has spoken. Rebekah's family reveals that they at least respected Abraham's God. They saw his will as necessary. They agreed to follow it, as the servant had described it. Upcoming verses will show, however, that the prospect of Rebekah leaving so soon will become an issue. The family will try to negotiate a delay, which Abraham's servant cannot accept. Genesis 24 verses 55 to 56. Verse 52. When Abraham's servant heard their words, he bowed himself to the earth before the Lord. Abraham's servant again demonstrates his trust in the Lord, the God of Abraham. His mission to find a wife for Isaac among Abraham's relatives has been successful well beyond what he likely imagined. Within the space of a few hours, he has gone from asking the Lord to lead him to the woman appointed for Isaac, Genesis 24 verses 12 to 15, to securing an agreement from Rebekah's family to allow her to travel with him back to Canaan for the marriage, Genesis 24 verse 51. The servant has acted in complete dependence on the Lord and now responds again by bowing before God in praise and worship for the success of his master's mission. In a way, the servant's relationship with God comes very close to our own. Rarely do Christians experience the kind of visits from the Lord that Adam, Noah, and Abraham did. Most often, we bring to him our requests, speaking to him in our hearts, Genesis 24 verse 45, and we take on faith that the circumstances that unfold include his direction to go one way or another. In looking back, we accept that the Lord has been leading us along the way to accomplish his will, especially as we have been in submission to him. That's certainly how Abraham's servant viewed his own interactions with the Lord. Verse 53. And the servant brought out jewelry of silver and of gold, and garments, and gave them to Rebekah. He also gave to her brother and to her mother costly ornaments. After securing the approval of Rebekah's brother and father to take her with him back to the land of Canaan to marry Isaac, Genesis 24 verse 51, the servant now concludes the arrangement with the giving of gifts to Rebekah, her mother, and her brother Laban. These gifts include silver and gold jewelry, as well as garments and expensive ornaments. These gifts would be part of the traditional wedding dowry of the times, items of value given to both the bride and the family of the bride by the bridegroom's family. Verse 54. And he and the men who were with him ate and drank, and they spent the night there. When they arose in the morning, he said, Send me away to my master. With his oath to Abraham satisfied and his duty to secure a wife for Isaac satisfied in miraculous time, the servant finally allows himself to relax. He and his men eat and drink and rest for the night. When morning comes, however, the servant is back on duty. He is eager to get on the road and back home to Abraham and Isaac, much more quickly than Rebekah's family anticipated she would be leaving, Genesis 24 verse 55. Knowing that she would be leaving for a distant land, likely forever, they will attempt to convince Abraham's servant to let Rebekah stay a few more days. Verse 55. Her brother and her mother said, Let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days, after that she may go. Abraham's servant has been successful in his mission. He has secured not just an appropriate wife for Abraham's son, he has found an exceptional young woman of Abraham's own immediate family, Genesis 24 verses 3-4, 12-19. Now he is eager to get on the road back to Canaan. Perhaps he just can't wait to show Abraham how the Lord has blessed their quest, or maybe he is concerned about the family changing their minds. The journey back to Canaan would have taken some time, as well, so any further delays would have only added to a long wait for Abraham and Isaac. In any case, Rebekah's brother Laban and her mother are not ready to let her go quite so quickly. Most Bible translations understand the text as a request for her to stay with them for another 10 days or so. However, some scholars believe the original language to be a request for Rebekah to stay for as long as a year. Given what's at stake, their request feels reasonable to us. To send a daughter off with a man they had known for less than a day to be married and settled in a strange land far away must have been emotional. Marriage, at that time, often involved a complete separation from family. However, this event is still sudden and unexpected. Most of us would expect some time to process the idea and perhaps hear more about Abraham, Isaac, and this new life they were sending Rebekah off to. As the following verses make clear, however, the servant wasn't interested in waiting even a day to depart. Verse 56. But he said to them, "Do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master." Why was Abraham's servant eager to leave with Rebekah so quickly after her family agreed to the marriage proposal? They had requested, very reasonably, 10 days or so delay before sending her off to be married in a strange land. Abraham's servant insisted on not being delayed. His reason is hard to understand, since the Lord has prospered my way. Did the servant feel that delaying their departure would somehow dishonor the success God had granted to him? Perhaps he was concerned that, given time to think about their agreement, Rebekah's family might change their mind. He might have assumed that, since God had granted his request to find the right woman so quickly, that God also intended this mission to be completed as soon as possible. One more possibility is that the servant was concerned Abraham might die before he could get back with this wife for Isaac. Abraham's words to the servant at the beginning of this chapter did sound like those of a dying man. Though Abraham went on to live several more decades, perhaps his health status was questionable for a season. And, lest we forget, Abraham is more than 130 years old at this point, Genesis 17 verse 17, 21 verse 5, 23:1-2. In any case, the servant wants to leave, immediately. Verse 57. They said, "Let us call the young woman and ask her." Rebekah's father and brother had agreed to allow her to marry Isaac, to go with Abraham's servant back to the land of Canaan to settle there, Genesis 24 verses 3-4, 51. They had, however, requested that she be allowed to stay with them for another 10 days or so before leaving, Genesis 24 verse 55. They know full well that this is a one-way trip. Rebekah will not be making visits back to Mesopotamia, but will be moving permanently to her new family. Abraham's servant insisted on not being delayed. He felt they needed to leave right away. Now for the first time, Rebekah is allowed a say in the matter. The family suggests they ask her if she is willing to go with Abraham's servant so quickly. It's possible they presumed that Rebekah would agree with them about waiting a few days before her departure. If she didn't want to go just yet, it would be difficult for Abraham's servant to compel them to make her leave with him so soon. Verse 58. And they called Rebekah and said to her, "Will you go with this man?" She said, "I will go." For the first time, apparently, Rebekah is being given some say in the matter of whether she will go with Abraham's servant back to Canaan. At least she is being asked if she is willing to leave immediately for this strange country to be married to a man she has not met before. It's possible that her brother and mother believe that, if asked, Rebekah would agree with them about waiting a few days. If so, they must have been disappointed about her immediate agreement, "I will go." We're not told if Rebekah's willingness to leave so quickly was due to a difficult relationship with her family or, more likely, if it represented a willingness to do the Lord's will as it had been so dramatically revealed in her life the day before. In either case, her statement is the final word. The family has agreed to terms, and Rebekah is willing. The company will prepare to depart. Verse 59. So they sent away Rebekah their sister and her nurse, and Abraham's servant and his men. With Rebekah's agreement to an immediate departure for her future in Canaan with Isaac, her family agreed to let her go. More specifically, they sent her away. It was truly their decision to make, and they did as she wished. Along with Rebekah, they sent her nurse, likely a caregiving servant/nanny who has helped to raise Rebekah from a small child. We will learn later that the nurse's name is Deborah, Genesis 35 verse 8. They also send along with Rebekah some of her young women or servant girls, Genesis 24 verse 61. Abraham's servant and his men are released by the family to depart as well. Verse 60. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, "Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him." Upon her departure to travel to the land of Canaan to marry Isaac, Rebekah's family blessed her, their sister, with this poem that may have been a traditional type of wedding blessing for a bride. However, it includes very similar language to the Lord's promises of blessing to Abraham earlier in Genesis 22 verse 17. Because of God's promises to Abraham, and because Rebekah would give birth to Jacob, the next in the covenant line of Israel, these blessings on her will absolutely come to pass. She will become, through her offspring, thousands of 10,000s, and her offspring will conquer their enemies, possessing the gates of their cities. Her son Jacob will be renamed Israel by God, making Rebekah, literally, the mother of God's chosen people. Context summary: Genesis 24 verses 60 to 67 describes how, after being blessed and sent away by her family, Rebekah journeys to the land of Canaan. Arriving in the Negeb, she is met by her future husband Isaac and given the tent of his late mother Sarah. Soon, they are married, taking their place as the next generation of God's chosen people. Verse 61. Then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. Thus the servant took Rebekah and went his way. Finally, the servant is able to depart and head back toward Canaan with Rebekah, her nurse, and her servant girls in tow on the 10 camels he brought with him. God has truly given success to Abraham's urgent mission to find Isaac an appropriate wife, a mother for the next generation of his offspring, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. This woman will bear a son to Isaac, whom they will name Jacob. Jacob will later be renamed Israel by God, as the founder of his chosen people. This makes Rebekah, in both a symbolic and literal sense, the mother of Israel. Verse 62. Now Isaac had returned from Beer-lahai-roi and was dwelling in the Negeb. The focus of the story of the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah now turns to Isaac. This is the first we see of him in this chapter. It's also the first we have seen of him since he was nearly sacrificed by Abraham in obedience to the Lord, Genesis 22 verses 1 to 14. We will learn later that Isaac is 40 years old, Genesis 25 verse 20. Here we see him living in the Negeb. Either Abraham and his estate had moved again after living in Hebron, or Isaac is living apart from Abraham. He has just returned from Beer-lahai-roi. Verse 63. And Isaac went out to meditate in the field toward evening. And he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there were camels coming. Isaac, 40, is now living in the Negeb region, Genesis 25 verse 20. He surely knows that Abraham's servant has been sent to find him a wife from among his father's extended family, Genesis 24 verses 3 to 4. On this evening, he goes out to meditate in a field. Scholars are not exactly sure what is meant by the word translated as, to meditate, here. The term is related to thoughtfulness and communication, but is only used here in the Bible. Was some form of meditation a regular discipline of Isaac's, or was he just thinking through some things on his mind? We don't really know. The English term meditate is used to translate other Hebrew words used in a positive sense elsewhere in Scripture, Psalm 1 verse 2, Joshua 1 verse 8, and is not the same as the modern concept espoused by Eastern philosophies such as Buddhism. In any case, Isaac looks up and sees the train of camels coming toward him. This is his first glimpse of Rebekah. Verse 64. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel. Led by Abraham's servant, the train of camels bearing Rebekah and her entourage are approaching Isaac's home in the Negeb region of Canaan. In the previous verse, he noticed their arrival. Now Rebekah sees Isaac, whom she is about to marry, for the first time. She quickly dismounts from her camel. This is the beginning of another excellent sign. Rebekah, without knowing that this is the man she is being brought to marry, finds him interesting enough to stop and ask questions. Verse 65. And said to the servant, "Who is that man, walking in the field to meet us?" The servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil and covered herself. The mission of Abraham's servant to find and deliver a wife for Isaac from among Abraham's extended family back in Mesopotamia is nearly complete, Genesis 24 verses 3-4. He leads a train of camels bearing Rebekah and her entourage to Isaac's home. It is evening. Isaac sees them coming while out in the field and walks in to meet them. Rebekah sees Isaac for the first time and quickly dismounts from the camel. She asks the servant who the man is. He confirms that it is his master Isaac. Rebekah quickly covers her face to hide her features from Isaac since they are not yet married. She may well have kept her face veiled until their wedding. Verse 66. And the servant told Isaac all the things that he had done. Having completed his mission, Abraham's servant made his report to Isaac of all he had done and all that had happened along the way. Given the repetition in detail in the servant's speech to Rebekah's family earlier in this chapter, Genesis 24 verses 34-49, it is unlikely he left anything out. It is very likely that he gave full credit to the Lord for leading him to Rebekah, for the family's approval of the marriage, and for bringing Rebekah to Isaac on this very evening. Why did the servant make his report to Isaac instead of Abraham? Some believe Abraham may well have died by this point, though the ages given in the Bible make it clear Abraham lived another 35 years after Isaac married Rebekah, Genesis 21 verse 5, 25 verse 20, 25:7. It's most likely that Abraham was simply in another location when the servant arrived and would receive the same report at another time. Verse 67. Then Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah his mother and took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. Here, the story of the wedding of Isaac and Rebekah reaches its conclusion. In this moment, Isaac and Rebekah seem to step into the shoes of Abraham and Sarah. He gives her his mother's tent. He soon marries her and begins to love her. Their relationship comforts him in the loss of Sarah. This is the first mention of Isaac's emotional response to his mother's death, which took place approximately 3 years before his marriage to Rebekah. The following chapter will describe the death of Abraham. Isaac will now become the patriarch of the family of the people of God. End of chapter 24. Please note: the material use in this video is from BibleRef.com, which is from Got Questions Ministries and is posted here to be read by immersive reader in the Edge browser. If you copy this material, please follow these rules. Content from BibleRef.com may not be used for any commercial purposes, or as part of any commercial work, without explicit prior written consent from Got Questions Ministries. Any use of our material should be properly credited. Please make it clear the content is from BibleRef.com. BibleRef.com content may not be altered, modified, or otherwise changed unless such changes are specifically noted.